Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. A light rain fell on the city's cracked sidewalks, reflecting the streetlights like flickering shards. In a narrow, dark alley, an elderly black man walked slowly, leaning on his cane. His face bore the marks of a long and arduous life, deep wrinkles, calloused hands, a tired but determined gaze. His steps, though measured, echoed with surprising confidence. He had no idea he was being watched. From around the corner of the alley, a young thug, his eyes burning with defiance and hatred, appeared. He sneered, his gaze filled with contempt for this old man whom he believed to be weak. "Old man, hurry up," he shouted, before shoving him violently. The old man staggered but remained standing. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the thug with an eerie calm. The young man, convinced he was dealing with a harmless old man, raised his hand and struck him without restraint. What he didn't know was that this man was more than just an old man. A former soldier and Vietnam veteran, he had survived the most unforgiving jungles, ambushes, firestorms, and the ever-present threat of death. Every scar, every trembling of his hand, bore the story of extraordinary courage and discipline. The silence of the alley seemed to grow heavier. The raindrops fell as if to underscore the rising tension. The young thug had just awakened an ancestral instinct, a mixture of strength, control, and vengeance that age had not dulled. This night would change the lives of both men forever. The thug sneered, confident. He thought he had a frail old man, incapable of defending himself. But the old man, motionless for a moment, took a step back, then another. His eyes, cold and piercing, fixed on the young man with an intensity that made the thug hesitate for a second. Then, with a fluid and surprising movement, the veteran dodged the next blow, using a fighting technique learned decades earlier in the jungles of Vietnam. In a flash, he sent the thug sprawling to the ground with unexpected force and precision. The young man tried to get up, but the veteran was already upon him, every move calculated, every action controlled. The thug struggled, surprised and panicked. The street suddenly seemed silent, as if holding its breath. The old man held him firmly, his gaze stern, revealing that age had in no way dulled his reflexes. "You don't know who you're dealing with, kid," he murmured, his voice low but full of authority. "You've awakened something you'll never understand." The young man, panting, realized his arrogance had just crumbled. This wasn't just any old man. He was a man who had faced death, who had survived where few others would have. And now he had realized that his own life was in danger if his arrogance persisted. The veteran, without inflicting a fatal injury, brought the thug to the ground and stepped back. The young man, trembling and humiliated, understood that he had just learned the hardest lesson of his life. The old man, catching his breath, placed his hand on his cane and continued on his way, leaving behind a transformed alleyway and a young man forever marked by the quiet strength of a veteran. The next morning, the neighborhood was already buzzing with rumors. Residents were speaking in hushed tones about the incident in the alley. "Did you hear what happened last night?" People were whispering in apartment building lobbies and outside cafes. The thug, the one who thought he was invincible, had been brought down by an old man, just an old man, or at least, that's what everyone thought. But for those who knew the veteran, it wasn't surprising. Many knew he had served in Vietnam, faced horror, and survived the unthinkable. What they didn't know was that this quiet strength would serve as a lesson to the entire community. In his apartment, the old man cleaned his cane, reflecting on the confrontation. He knew that brute violence solved nothing, but he wanted to make an impact, to show that fear and brutality had no place here. He decided then not to remain in the shadows. He would start talking to the young people in the neighborhood, sharing his story, teaching them discipline, respect, and courage. The thug, for his part, now avoided the old man. Every street corner, every glance, reminded him of his humiliation. His reputation in the neighborhood began to falter. The other young people, witnesses to the incident, began to reflect on their actions. Fear mixed with respect slowly took hold. The veteran, without raising his fist a second time, had just sown a seed in the neighborhood. A seed of respect, courage, and justice. And all those who crossed his path began to understand that you should never judge a book by its cover. The alley where it all began remained silent, but now it carried within it the story of an old black man, a former soldier, who had transformed fear and violence into a lasting lesson for all. A few days later, the neighborhood was in turmoil. The residents were still talking about the incident, and the young thug felt everyone's gaze upon him. He had lost his arrogance, replaced by a persistent fear and a growing shame. The veteran, for his part, decided it was time to bring this story to a close. He invited the young man to join him in the small park near the alley where it had all begun. The curious neighbors gathered discreetly to watch, but kept their distance. The young man arrived hesitantly, his gaze averted. The veteran was waiting for him, upright and calm, his civilian uniform hinting at his military past. He placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder and said in a low but powerful voice, "You think that strength gives you the right to humiliate others. You think that fear and violence can impose respect. But look around you." He gestured towards the neighbors, the children and adults who were watching him. True courage is not about striking, but about protecting, teaching, and respecting. What you did was not strength, it was weakness. The young man, trembling, lowered his head. Tears welled up in his eyes. The lesson was clear: true power lies not in violence, but in self-control and dignity. The veteran didn't strike him once. His mere gaze, his calm demeanor, and his authority were enough to transform the young man. From that day on, the thug changed. He began to listen, to learn, to understand that respect and discipline were worth far more than fear. And throughout the neighborhood, people long remembered that night when an old black man, a Vietnam veteran, transformed fear into respect, violence into a lesson, and showed that age and wisdom can be more powerful than brute force. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to slowly change. The young people who once terrorized the streets now looked at the veteran with respect, even admiration. Some came to talk to him, curious to learn about his past, his experiences in Vietnam, and above all, his life lessons. The thug, however, had completely changed. He was no longer the arrogant and violent teenager he once was. He now helped the younger ones channel their energy, resolving their conflicts through dialogue rather than force. The veteran had transformed him without raising a hand, through example, discipline, and wisdom. The old man even organized a few gatherings in the park where it had all begun. He recounted his memories, spoke of difficult choices, fear and courage, and above all, the importance of mutual respect. Each story captivated the residents, young and old, and reinforced the idea that the greatest strength lies in self-control and dignity. The neighborhood children began calling him Grandpa Courage. Even the adults, who had often turned a blind eye to the violence, felt inspired by his presence. The alley where the thug had attacked him became a symbol, a place where intimidation had failed in the face of the wisdom and courage of a man who had been through hell and survived. The veteran, now an iconic figure in the neighborhood, had sown more than fear in those who wished to do harm. He had sown respect, discipline, and hope. His legacy lay not only in his past exploits, but in the transformation of those around him. And whenever conflict arose, everyone remembered the old man's lesson: true power comes not from the fist, but from the mind.